Good morning. Thank you very much, Imam Talib. Thank you for the kind presentation. And also I would like to thank Global Peace Foundation, the colleagues at Global Peace Foundation, but also the colleagues here in Manila for this great conference. It's an honor to be back at a conference of Global Peace Foundation. I was also honored to participate and speak at the previous one in Belfast in September. So I'm really honored to be back here. Thank you. So as Imam Talib said, I'll focus on what I call Middle Eastern terrorism and authoritarianism in an age of Western populism. That is the title of my presentation today. The question we are asked to address, and as Imam Talib presented them briefly at this session, are immensely crucial and relevant. Yet I think they are more or less the same questions we discussed in Belfast in September last year. This doesn't mean that they are not important. On the contrary, they deal with one of the core issues of our time, which is at the same time at the heart of what my organization, East-West Institute, is addressing, namely how to counter violent extremism and make our world a safer place. But in order for these questions to be dynamic and responsive in the face of rapid political changes in the West and the Middle East, I would like to connect countering violent extremism to two transformative phenomena that would impact peace building in the coming years, namely authoritarianism in the Middle East and populism in the West. How much a difference 6 months can make? Last time we met in Belfast, as I said, in September last year, back then Brexit was a fact, but the US and with it the world was engulfed in what I can call an existential election campaign that had the potential to change world politics with wide-ranging implications for the fight against ISIS and other extremist groups. The election of Donald Trump and possible victories of populist and far-right parties in upcoming elections in France and Netherlands, where I come from, may reshape the fight against violent Islamic groups such as ISIS. This will definitely impact the work of peace-building organizations. While ISIS and other radical Islamist groups who are committing horrible crimes against Muslims and non-Muslims should be defeated, the key questions are, what is the best approach? And who are the best strategic and sustainable allies in this tectonic battle? Geopolitical shifts and populist surges in the West alongside fatigue with complex conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and beyond strongly suggest that a hardcore security approach and alliance with authoritarian regimes in Middle East perhaps will be the most dominant strategy in the coming years. This would result in the rehabilitation and resilience of repressive regimes such as Syria's Assad and authoritarian and corrupt leaders in Iraq and other countries in the region. This strategy might yield military successes in the short term, but in the long run will only strengthen apocalyptic groups like ISIS. To make matters worse, it will give autocrats a new lease on life. This means that Middle East could be condemned for the foreseeable future to a vicious cycle of violence committed by autocrats and apocalyptic ideologies. The civilian population and peaceful activists who want a dignified and democratic rule will be caught in between and will continue to remain the real victims as it is the case at the moment. Going back to the topic of our session, namely root causes of violent extremism, what is the link between jihadi, Salafi terrorism and authoritarianism? In my view, one of the structural reasons for the rise of groups like ISIS is the systemic use of violence by the so-called secular and religious regimes alike in the Middle East to quell dissent, historically. The history of post-colonial states in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and other countries in the Middle East is by and large a history of horrible human rights violations against civilian people, peaceful protest, and armed groups, including public executions, even stonings and beheadings, and use of chemical and biological weapons, and genocide. We have seen this in Iraq, in Syria, but also in other countries by Saddam Hussein, by Assad, and other groups and regimes. The barbarism of the henchmen of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-declared leader of ISIS, doesn't originate from a vacuum. They build on are the logical conclusions of and even refine the unimaginable brutality of the human rights violations of Saddam Hussein, Hafiz and Bashar al-Assad, Gaddafi, and other dictators. ISIS is an authoritarian byproduct, a consequence and not a cause of the current catastrophe in the Middle East. The overall extremely violent political culture and prisons were and are top universities for the graduation of the leaders as well as rank and file fighters of ISIS and other extremist groups. The only difference between ISIS and dictators is that ISIS meticulously documents and broadcasts its barbarism with a show of pride. The most recent report of Amnesty International on Syria, entitled Human Slaughterhouse, Mass Hangings and Extermination at Saidnaya prison in Syria, is a gruesome reminder of the terrible human rights violations committed by the regime and a warning of what may yet still happen in Syria. These regimes create the right environment for the birth of barbaric leaders like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi rather than Nelson Mandela. Political violence and human rights violations are related to economic corruption. And by corruption, I don't mean petty corruption of low, mid-level bureaucracy, but rather systemic corruption at the highest echelons of power. Despite their many historic, political, economic, and social differences, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Nigeria, and I can go on, they share one common curse, and that is the ubiquitous, exorbitant, and unprecedented corruption of ruling elites that create failed states and provide the perfect habitat for the emergence and advancement of violent extremism. Perhaps one of the books that pays sufficient attention to this global problem is the one aptly entitled The Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security by Sarah Chase. To Ms. Chase, and I quote, "Since the late 90s, corruption has reached such an extent that some governments resemble glorified criminal gangs, bent solely on their own enrichment. These kleptocrats drive indignant population to extremism, ranging from revolution to militant puritanic religion like ISIS," unquote. The political order that emerged in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein dismally failed to produce an inclusive political pact in which all groups and citizens see the state as their Iraq. When Mosul fell to ISIS in June 2014, Iraq's national budget was over $141 billion, $141 billion. Ruling elites from Shiite, Sunni, and Kurdish backgrounds across the board have used these billions to enrich themselves and their cronies, strengthening party militias, and instead of building inclusive national institutions, including professional armies. The outrageous carelessness and scandals, double standards of the international community towards the Syrian conflict has led to a Syrian heartbreak, the worst refugee crisis since World War II, and a protracted state of violence with no end in sight. Al-Assad's chemical weapons were destroyed by the UN, but his barrel bombs were left untouched only to wreak death and destruction in Syrian cities. Thus, it's not surprise that ISIS and other radical groups are mushrooming in such a conducive and ideal habitat. The Trump administration's ban on Syrians and nationals from 7 Muslim majority nations is the latest example of the rehabilitation of the Assad regime. US immigration authorities barred entry only a couple of days back to a 21-year-old Syrian cinematographer, even though he had a valid visa, who worked on a harrowing film about his nation's civil war called The White Helmets. This 40-minute documentary gives a window into the lives of the group's volunteers as they scramble to pull people from the rubble of buildings flattened in bombing raids, particularly in Aleppo. According to the founder of White Helmets, Khalid Saleh, the group saved 82,000 lives, including children and babies. I urge everyone to watch this documentary, which won an Academy Award this week. President Trump's travel ban will only strengthen Assad, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. We live in an extremely dark time. Middle Eastern despotism, violent jihadi Salafism, and Western populism strengthen each other with disastrous consequences for the world. One way to counter this terrible trend is to link the struggle for dignity and democracy against Middle Eastern authoritarianism and terrorism to the new struggle against populism in the West. We need, though, to distinguish between the majority of voters who vote for populist and far-right parties and those who are truly xenophobic. People are genuinely, rightly, and truly terrified by the threat of terrorist attacks by ISIS in the West. It is this social base and fear that needs to be addressed in order to make the world a safer place and help peaceful protests against autocrats in the long march for a dignified and democratic existence in Middle East. In these dark times, this is a tall order, but we don't have an alternative. More than ever, we should commit to energized activism, new and transformative ideas, and above all, hope. To quote Raymond Williams, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing, unquote. Thank you very much for your attention.